Yeah, exactly. No, I thought I'd sign in a bit early.
Yeah, and so this meeting is recorded.
Okay.
We just for just in case you need to know, and just a couple more minutes.
Mm-hmm. So the people that we're going to be talking to, are they students? I'm not sure exactly.
Well, they have actually they are different, diverse background. Like most of the students, like undergraduate, graduate students, like some are theology, some are like different backgrounds, like from teachers, like from housewives, like anybody who are interested in the the history of science. And I'm just I am a faculty member of technology faculty in Selçuk University. I'm like a computer engineer in training, and also I have I had actually like the founding general manager of the Konya Science Center. Well, in terms of it's like a science museum. And so since then, I have been really interested as like amateurish, like history of science. So we start a couple times. I read myself, and I start reading, like founding this kind of groups. I think we could start officially.
Okay.
So you are ready? Okay, let's start officially. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this special Halka Book Club final analysis meeting. I am Dr. Ali Setinkaya, and I will be moderating tonight's conversation with Dr. Patricia Fara, author of Science at 4,000 Years History. For those joining us first time, Halka is our book club here in Konya, Turkey. Name Halka comes from traditional Islamic practice of forming learning circles, where students and scholars would sit in a ring around a teacher to discuss religious texts, philosophy, and knowledge. This centuries-old tradition of communal learning and dialogue inspires our modern book club approach, where we whether physically or virtually, to explore ideas together in a circle of shared discovery. We are thrilled to have this opportunity to speak directly with Dr. Fara. We are recording tonight's session for those who could not join us live. Google Meet is, well, supposed to provide live translation subtitles to help bridge any language barriers. Dr. Fara, science historian at Clara College, Cambridge. Her book has been our recent reading selection at Halka. It's opened our eyes how science is truly a global topic, not just Western. Dr. Fara, welcome. We are so honored you could join Halka tonight. Before we begin, could you share what inspired you to write this sweeping history of science? Yes.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you ever so much for inviting me. And I can see there's people pinging in from all over the place. So I've got a very big audience. So welcome to everybody and thank you for giving up your time. So I first got the idea for writing this book about 20 years before I actually wrote it. I went to a conference in London. I was a student at the time. And I went to a conference in London called Getting the Big Picture. And people stood up one after the other and they said, what we really need is a big picture history of science, of how history's happened, how science has happened over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. And I was sitting there as a PhD student and I thought, yes, that's the book that I want to write. So 20 years later, I had a go at writing it. And it's been quite interesting for me because it was about 20 years ago that I wrote the book. It came out in 2009, which meant that I finished writing it in about 2006 or 2007. So it's almost 20 years since I wrote it. It's about 10 years since I even looked at it. So it was quite interesting for me to sort of skim through and see what I'd written earlier. One of my first conclusions was that while I was writing it, I had tried very, very, very hard to get away from a Eurocentric and Anglocentric position. I wanted to write a big history of science that would include everything that happened all over the world. But looking at it now, I see that I was still very constrained by the history of science education I'd been up in. And if I were to write something now, I think it would be impossible to try, because so much work has been done on all the interactions between different people in different parts of the globe, that I think some general picture of the evolution of science over the millennia has become even more complicated than the way in which I presented it.
Well, it's very nice that you have written it, and it's nice that we have this opportunity to have it and read it, and it's very nice to the talking tonight here. So the second question is, how has your perspective on science history changed in 20 years since writing the book? What new insights or shifts thinking have emerged for you?
Okay, well, obviously during the last 20 years, I've carried out a lot of my own research. I've got more interested in women, for example, and in pictures. And the main focus of my own research is from the 18th to the 20th centuries. But I've been to a lot of talks that other people have given, and I've read lots of other books. And the emphasis now is very much looking at interactions across the globe. So instead of seeing one centre of power, for example, England or Great Britain was one very important centre of power in the 19th century, the passion now is to see smaller local centres of power all over the world, so that instead of a model where you've got one single dominating country, Great Britain, for example, or perhaps America, or perhaps Russia, instead of just seeing one dominating country, there's a whole network of centres all around the globe which are all interacting with each other. And I think that makes the picture far more complicated. I mean, looking back at the book that I wrote, I can see that there's nothing about India, the whole of the subcontinent of India, which is enormous and has been very powerful at various times in the past. There's also nothing about the Americas, and particularly South America. So those are two areas which are just missing. So I think that's one major change that there's in the 20 years since I wrote the book. The picture has become much more complicated.
Yeah, I think, yes, it's getting much more complicated. And also, history of science, like comparing the other areas, like comparatively new brand of like history, right? Can we say that?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
It's emerging new one, like the writing the history of the science, comparing the earlier, as a political or war. So comparatively new one. Do you agree with that?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand what you're asking me. Let's try it again. So the quality of the line is not very good. I can't really hear very well.
Okay, so let's move to another question. Like, as a historian of science, which scientific myths particularly frustrate you? Could you help us debunk some common misconceptions about how science has developed? Can you get this? Can you hear me? No problem. Can you hear me?
I can, but there's so much noise on the line, it's very difficult. There's a lot of dinging of people coming in, and the line is very crackly. So say your question again. Sorry.
Okay, I'll repeat the question again.
Yeah.
As a historian of science, which scientific myths particularly frustrate you?
Which scientific myths particularly frustrate me? Okay, so there's several myths about the development of the history of science. I think the most obvious myth is that science is a cumulative process which progresses steadily towards the truth. So if you want to use a visual image, it's like there's a big mountain with truth at the top, and humanity is gradually climbing up the side of the mountain, reaching a true answer. I think in contrast, science is much more of a branching process. It's much more cumulative. It's much more like evolution, that you come to different points and people either go off in one direction or in another direction. So if you start from the same position, different people in different parts of the world will reach different conclusions. I don't think there is an absolute scientific truth. There's lots of different ways of achieving scientific knowledge, and they all to some extent represent what's happening in the world, but they're not necessarily the same as each other. Another great myth is that there are special people who are geniuses, who somehow, a bit like religious figures, are somehow different from ordinary mortals, that they're blessed with special intelligence. I think the most obvious example is Isaac Newton, but there's also Einstein, for example, would be another very good example, or Charles Darwin, any of these great heroes. And one of the myths is that they somehow are specially gifted and that they have a flash of inspiration, rather like Archimedes jumping out of the bath and shouting Eureka, and they suddenly arrive at absolute truth. I don't think that's true either. I think scientists are just ordinary people. Yes, they're very clever, but a lot of publicity goes into making them appear to be geniuses, where in fact they're often they're almost always building on the insights of other people. Another great myth is that science and religion are completely distinct from one another. If you look back into the past, you find that what we would call scientific solutions often emerge from religious contexts. So again, if you think of Isaac Newton, the whole reason that he practiced natural philosophy, that he carried out scientific inquiries into the world, was because he wanted to get closer to God. So if the further back in time you go, the more science and religion are closely intertwined. They're not separate at all. And the same is true of science and what might loosely call magic, or practices such as alchemy, which are now discredited as bringing true knowledge. What we now call scientific knowledge emerged out of those contexts. So science, it seems to me, is a very, very cumulative process. It's very difficult to tell its history because science is a modern concept. What science is constantly changing. And 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, or even 200 or 300 years ago, no such thing as science existed. So you're trying to tell the story of something that didn't used to exist. So you have to look back in the past and you pick out elements from the past that lead to the present. But that is very, very different from imagining, which some people do, imagining that there's something called science and you can trace its absolute history independently of any other ventures. Is that enough myths for the moment?
Yeah, I think you mentioned the long geniuses, like the Newton and Apple is very persistent. How
Yes.
does this distort our understanding of how scientific progress actually happens?
I think making someone into a genius, for one thing, making somebody a genius makes for a very good story. And there's artistic geniuses as well. It's not just scientific geniuses. And if you take the example of Isaac Newton and his apple, so supposedly he sat and watched an apple fall, and that gave him the concept of gravity in a momentary and instantaneous flash of inspiration. One thing that happened was it took him about 20 years after he may or may not have conceived the concept of gravity. It took 20 years of hard calculation and maths before he was ready to publish his theories. But also during his lifetime, no one knew about the story of the apple. It was an idea that he suggested a few years before he died. But before then, no one had heard of it. It wasn't a story that he grew up with. And in fact, nobody really knew about the story of the apple until long after he died. He died in 1727, and it wasn't until the early 19th century, the early 1800s, that the story of the apple tree became important. So a lot of establishing his reputation as a genius was due to a sort of public relations machine, a publicity organization, like creating advertisements, that boosted his reputation and told the story of the apple long after he died.
Yes. Regarding this apple, is there anything with the apple with the like coming from heaven, like Adam and Eve apple? And
yes, I mean there is one version of the story that the apple had been sent by God. I think also in terms of the Christian religion, it makes him very much like a religious saint, because saints often had flashes of inspiration from God, and also saints often were marked by a particular tree. And so Isaac Newton's apple tree is rather like the tree of a saint at a special place. And his special place is the cottage at Woolsthorpe, which is in the countryside in England, which is where the apple tree is. And that cottage in the countryside at a place called Woolsthorpe has become rather like a site of Christian pilgrimage, with its own tree marking a place that is holy. And people want to go back to his birthplace. It's almost like touching the robes of a saint, that you go back to a genius's birthplace, and somehow the atmosphere is filled with some special aura, some special atmosphere relating to the person being worshipped. So I think it gives that geniuses have a sort of quasi-religious significance.
So can we call, let's say in this example, Isaac Newton as a religious person per se, like versus magician versus scientist?
Isaac Newton certainly wasn't a scientist, because the word wasn't invented until long after he died, not until the 1830s. And in fact, the word scientist wasn't even used much in English until the 20th century. So that's another problem about telling the history of science, is that the word scientist didn't even exist. So whatever it was that people were doing up until before the 20th century, it was very, very different from modern science, because there weren't any scientists doing whatever they were doing. Isaac Newton himself was certainly an extremely religious person. He was rather unorthodox in terms of Christianity, but he was deeply, deeply religious.
For the next question, like in your book, your book argues that pure objectivity in science and myth. How should we understand scientific knowledge? Always influenced by the cultural context.
Yes, I mean, it seems to me that there's a lot of scientific knowledge that can be sort of taken as true. I mean, in particular, if you think of drugs and medicines, they either work or they don't work. And whatever the cultural context is, apples aren't suddenly going to start moving upwards instead of moving downwards. But and there is a sense that theories are never fixed. And I think one very good example would be relativity theory. I mean, the theory of gravity was accepted until the early 20th century as being absolutely incontrovertibly true. And then Einstein came along with relativity and showed that Newtonian gravity is only relevant, only useful under certain circumstances. I think one of the main criteria of a theory is perhaps not whether it's true, but whether it's useful. So if you think of the example of phlogiston, phlogiston is now deemed to be an imaginary substance, and it's a substance that was used during the 18th century to explain how metal ores in mines are melted and how they come to form metals. And it's sort of rather like, in a way, the opposite of oxygen. I mean, the way we interpret it interpret it as a metal ore. If you heat an ore of metal, some mineral metal that you find in a mine, you drive off the oxygen. The phlogiston view is the other way around, that if you heat the ore, it absorbs phlogiston and turns into the metal. That was a theory that worked very satisfactorily for about 60 or 70 years. And then the oxygen theory came along and overturned it. And perhaps one day the theory of oxygen will be overturned. Perhaps it'll just be a model. But I think theories, scientific theories, can always be overturned. They're always understood in different ways, in different contexts. And it's going back to the sort of evolutionary model of science. If people only develop theories to explain what they need to explain, and in different contexts, in different societies, in different cultures, different theories are going to be developed.
Okay. For example, for the phlogiston, you said, right? During the Second World War, the Germans, when they invaded France, first, I think, they tackled the statue of the Lavoisier, I think, because he was the founder, let's per se, the oxygen versus phlogiston. Is this correct?
Yeah, yes. They did. That is true. He did, but I mean, he didn't discover oxygen. I mean, that's another good example. I mean, oxygen was discovered in England before Lavoisier. Oxygen was discovered by Joseph Priestley, but for Joseph Priestley saw it in a different cultural context, and he found that oxygen was indeed very pure, and that things would burn very brightly in oxygen, that oxygen would keep mice or birds alive for a long period of time. So for him, it was he called it dephlogisticated air. It was the air from which all the phlogiston impurities have been removed. So you've got one substance, a gas, which for Priestley was air without the phlogiston in, and for Lavoisier, and for us now, it's called oxygen. So it's obviously the same gas that's out there, but culturally it was viewed in two completely different ways. And right, the theory of phlogiston was invented by Stahl, who was German, and the theory particularly in German minds for about 100 years. And it was seen as being very useful because it worked. I mean, those are the theories. There's one criterion of a scientific theory is whether it works, whether it predicts what's going to happen. And phlogiston worked a very long time until everything could be weighed sufficiently accurately, and then it no longer turned out to be useful.
Right. Okay. In your book, you have shown how political, economic, and social factors shape scientific progress. Could you give us some favorite examples that illustrate these connections? For example, like Einstein versus Newton. For example, Newton embodied the whole Great Britain's all the successes and stuff, versus, because during especially just eve of the Second World War, they would like German probably wanted to destroy all the application of the the Great Britain's success stories, like starting with Newton, I think, in terms of in the political and economic and social factors.
Well, I mean, Einstein himself absolutely revered Newton. Einstein himself had no antipathy to Newton, and I think the way the political and social factors affecting science, I think more strongly of something like the atomic bomb, which would never have been developed by America if the government hadn't been involved. I mean, I think the atomic bomb is a perfect example of how politics and science are very, very closely enmeshed, because it was the funding to develop the atomic bomb was provided by the government. So it was as much a political enterprise as it was a scientific enterprise.
In terms of, let's say, industry-military complex, like university, government, and the industry, should we say, or is it correct to say, even the Newton or other, let's say, call them scientists, always like first defense, like today, is the priority to to make science work that way? Can you say that?
I think that's one way in which science has changed enormously, is that the modern priority among scientists nowadays depend on government funding, and one of their major priorities is to provide results that are going to be useful for society. If you go back 200 or 300 years, there wasn't any government funding, and certainly in Britain at least, people who were practicing science were trying to make money out of it, or else they were trying to find, they had enough money that they were trying to find out things that were interesting, and they weren't particularly concerned about the applications of science. In fact, quite a lot of them thought it was wrong for science to have applications. You should just find out true knowledge for its own sake. And I think that's one of the huge shifts that there's been during the last 50 years or so, is that government science is increasingly dependent on government funding, and if scientists want to carry out a particular project, they have to demonstrate that it's going to be useful, that it's going to have impact.
For example, like connecting with the current zeitgeist for the climate, regarding the climate, scientists who are working on the climate, they would get really good funding when they show all the bad news. Is it correct?
I think that that was one of the things that I tried to explain in my book. So up until the 1970s, 1980s, the general consensus of opinion was that the world was heading towards a new ice age, and this when some scientists started issuing warnings that no, in fact, on the contrary, instead of going towards an ice age, the planet was heating up. There was a lot of opposition to that idea, and so a lot of scientists reverted to giving very, very alarmist predictions of what was happening, and they sort of told extreme versions in order to get public support, in order to get funding. Which is that what you're referring to? It's all sort of
yes.
So they were all until about the 1980s, 1990s even. There was still a lot of hostility between groups of scientists who predicted there was going to be global warming, and other groups of scientists who predicted that, on the contrary, the world was going to get colder and colder. And that was one of the things that really surprised me after my book was published. I outlined this debate. By that stage, everybody sensible, including me, was very much a believer in global warming and thought it was essential that we should do something to prevent climate change. But I was accused in some reviews of being a climate denier because I had spelled out the fact that there had been a debate about it in the past. But it's really hard to think now. In global warming seems such a definite fact of life, but
Right.
30 years ago, people, very reputable scientists, were arguing against it and saying that there was nothing to worry about. It seems quite extraordinary looking back.
Your work has been instrumental in highlighting forgotten contributions of women to science. Could you share some particularly compelling examples of women whose scientific work deserves more recognition?
Okay, well, my favorite woman in the whole of the history of science, my favorite woman is a French woman called Émilie du Châtelet. And she lived in the 18th century, and she was the first person to translate Isaac Newton's Principia, his book on gravity. She translated it from the Latin into French, and it's still the only existing translation in French. And she was very rich. Her family was very rich, so she had tutors when she was little. Her father, very unusually, let her study everything. So she spoke Latin, she spoke Greek, she could do maths. She was extremely well educated. And when she was in her 20s, she was rich enough to hire some mathematical experts to teach her Newtonian mathematics. And the reason that I admire her so much is that she wrote quite a lot philosophically, and she said the most important thing in life is to gain pleasure out of it. And by gaining pleasure, she meant what were then traditional feminine pleasures, such as she loved to dance, she loved gambling, she loved wearing fine clothes, but she also loved working. She thought it was an extreme form of pleasure. And she carried out experiments. She wrote original books of her own, trying to reconcile the theories of Leibniz, Descartes, and Newton. And then she started translating Isaac Newton's Principia. And she discovered, to her horror, that she was pregnant, and she was already 40, which for a woman in the 18th century was very elderly. And so she just worked and worked and worked. She worked through the night and dipped her hands into ice cold water so that she would stay awake. And she worked desperately hard, and she finished the translation. And it wasn't just a translation. She also provided her own commentary on where she thought Newton had gone wrong. And she also provided details of all the experiments that had been carried out since Newton wrote the book. And she finished it about a week before the baby died. And then she died in childbirth. And so she never saw her book published, but it was published, and it had an enormous impact on France, because during the 18th century, French people were very reluctant to believe that Newton was right. French people wanted to believe in the theories of René Descartes, their own national hero. So this war between Descartes and Newton was like a political war between England and France. And she was one of the most influential people in persuading the French nation that Newton was right and Descartes was wrong. So she is the woman above all that I admire and I would love to meet. I think she's absolutely terrific. There's lots of other women. One of them wasn't by any means what we would call a scientist at all. She was a woman called Mary Wortley Montagu. And the reason I thought of her is she became very famous in England during COVID because she was one of the people who was first responsible for introducing smallpox inoculation into England. And the way she did that was her husband was a diplomat and they got posted to Turkey. So she lived in what was then Constantinople for several years. And apparently there were lots of women who were inoculating people against smallpox by giving them very, very small doses of the illness. And she was brave enough to have her own children inoculated in the Turkish manner. And then she went back to England and persuaded people in England that this inoculation was a good idea. And she enlisted the help of the Queen of England, who also had her own children inoculated. So this woman, Mary Wortley Montagu, who didn't really She was well educated, but she didn't have any scientific education. She wasn't a scientist. She wasn't a doctor. But by importing that Turkish method, ensured that a lot of people in Britain, were spared having smallpox. And the conventional story is that the smallpox vaccination was introduced by a man much later in the century. But what became clear while England was going through COVID was that actually the first attempts to inoculate against smallpox were made by a woman. So I think Mary Wortley Montagu is another example of someone who needs to be celebrated and remembered. And she's a very good example, I think, as well, of how what we regard as scientific change, scientific innovation, was launched by people who had nothing to do with science. She wasn't a scientist herself, but there was no opportunity for her to study science. So that's another example. I've got lots more examples I could give.
Follow up on this question. Do you see any parallels between historical barriers women faced in science and challenges that persist today? Maybe you could give some examples.
So examples of barriers that women have faced in science and well, one of the great barriers when you go further back in history, one of the great obstacles that women faced was that they couldn't have the same education as their brothers. So they weren't allowed to go to university. The first colleges, the first universities for women didn't open until the 19th century, the 1800s. And I think that has changed. Obviously, that university education is now open to women, but there's still far fewer women applying to read scientific subjects than there are men. And in this country, at least, I don't know what it's like in Turkey, but in this country, a lot of the girls' schools don't have very effective maths and science teachers. So I think that's a problem. The biggest problem, I think, that women in science now face is childcare. And all the statistics show that although in principle every single job is equally open to men and to women, in practice women earn rather less than men do, even though men and women earn equal pay for equal work. So all the evidence is in Great Britain that women are not getting to the top of scientific careers. And I think one of the major obstacles to that is childcare, because women obviously have to take a year or two out while they're having babies, and that means that they fall behind on their research, which means they have less research to show for the length of time they've spent in their career. And also childcare in this country can be extremely expensive. And if you've got two people looking after the children, and you have to one of them has to be sacrificed in order to pay for the childcare, most often it's the woman whose career is sacrificed because she's earning less than the man who is the father of her children. So that's another problem that is very current nowadays. And I think that unfortunately there's still among some people there's prejudice against women doing science, but I mean even in my own lifetime it's changed enormously since I was at university.
Yes, thank you. Like I have a couple more to ask, and then we will get a couple more questions from participants. One question, I'm not sure how could you answer, but I'll ask anyway. Joseph Needham famously asked why the scientific revolution occurred in Europe rather than China, despite China's earlier technological superiority. And your book offers fresh perspective on this question. What are your thoughts on why these transformative changes happened, and where and why, when they did? And maybe in terms of the same question, why it didn't happen Ottomans, or China or India?
Okay, well, I mean, one thing I would say straight away is one of the great myths about science, the question that you asked me earlier. One of the myths that I didn't mention was the myth that there was a scientific revolution, or that there was a chemical revolution, or a Darwinian revolution. I don't believe that revolutions happen in science. I think science changes slowly, and I think it changes cumulative. I don't think there is a sudden switch from one way of thinking to another way of thinking. The scientific revolution is a very, very strange creation. It only really became important during the 20th century. And it became a sort of form of publicity for after the Second World War, to unify the world in terms of a common religion, a common sort of faith, a common faith in scientific progress, rather than having diverse religions across the world. And in that aspiration, it certainly totally failed. So the first myth is, I don't believe there was a scientific revolution. So I think Joseph Needham was wrong to ask the question in the first place, why wasn't there a scientific revolution in China? Certainly until the 17th, 18th century, China was far more advanced technologically than the rest of Europe. But in order for inventions to succeed, to proliferate, to dominate a country, you don't just need the inventions to happen, you need to have the whole social and political framework in which they can take place. So in China, China was a very bureaucratic country. It was very much sort of ruled from above. There wasn't any room for personal initiative, whereas in a country like Britain, for example, there were lots of people who were competing to make money. They wanted to take advantage of technological change, so there was a sort of political climate that fostered and encouraged invention and change, whereas the atmosphere, the whole social atmosphere in China was one that encouraged stability and discouraged change. So the three big inventions that in Europe, three big inventions that were said to characterize our Renaissance were gunpowder, compasses, and printing. And in fact, all those inventions had taken place in China several hundred years earlier, but nothing had ever happened to them. The Chinese weren't great navigators, so they didn't need magnetic compasses to travel overseas. They didn't have much incentive to change their printing processes, and so these developments all took off in Europe, even though they'd occurred earlier in China, because of the different forms of government and the way that the society was structured. It's rather like saying in ancient Greece, there was a little device called Hero's Sphere, which was a small toy, a metal sphere with water inside it, and the water was heated up so that puffs of steam came out, and so that made the sphere turn round on its own axis. And there's a lot of people who would like to say that Hero's Sphere was proof that the Greeks developed industrialization and steam power before Britain, but it didn't, because there was no social infrastructure to support industry. You had to go to a country like Britain, which had huge reserves of coal and iron and wood for heating, where you've got a government that was willing to encourage invention, a tax system that encouraged people to industrialize, to create steam engines, to compete against each other. So you don't just need the physical invention, you need the social networking and the social structure in order for those inventions to be realized and to take off and to expand.
Okay. We have a couple questions from our participants. You could see them in call messages section in the Meet application. Actually, two of them seems similar, which we talked. Actually, it's one of the discussions we had. For example, Alexander von Humboldt, you know, the famous German.
Alexander von Humboldt, who went to South America.
Yes. So we are actually we talk and we ask the same question and again. What is the main motivation? Let's say for example, for von Humboldt, to using his own money, his own time, his own labor, just like I think in 5 years, without like for mostly uncharted territories like the Amazon jungle, like Chimborazo mountain, like almost died, like freezing, I think. So we are just curious with the group, actually, the Halka members, how could we define this motivation?
How could he
define the motivation of spending his own money, labor, like going all over 5 years? Just what is the motivation behind all of this? Like, how would you call
What's the motivation? I mean, some people love exploring. He also had a motivation to make money. I think he made quite a fortune out of selling guano, which is basically bird excrement. I mean, explorers still exist who love the sense of adventure, to love to see what they can find. And I think if you were rich enough to afford it, then that's what some people wanted to do. And I mean, he was a fantastic explorer. I think he also was. He was responsible for recording a lot of numerical observations, numerical data, and compiling those to create very precise observations of exactly how the world's climate and its temperature and its wind pressure and things like that, how they change. So he was an extremely important researcher. I mean, he wasn't just a flamboyant young man who set off. He was very meticulous.
One more question. Like, in the introduction of the book, it states that writing history is not about organizing the facts, but about deciding whom to include and whom to exclude. And the participant asked, my question is, according to Ms. Patricia Fara, what determines this selection? What is the criteria for exclusion in order to construct a historical narrative? We see many well-known names in the book that did you understand the question?
I mean, I think one of the joys of history is because my first degree was in physics, and in physics you have to get the facts right. But I think one of the things in history is you have to get the facts right, but you can interpret the facts in different sort of ways. So what criteria for inclusion and exclusion? I mean, depends to some extent on personal choice, which is why different people write different versions of history. So just one example, I probably included more women than other people would have done. So that for me, that's one criterion of choice. Another criterion is what seems to make a coherent story, but in a sense, you have to have your model of what the story is in advance. You have to select your facts to suit the story, but you also have to make sure that your story is consonant, that it can be reconciled with all the facts that are available. And there's also new facts come up. You do research and you find new facts that you can weave into an interesting story. So when I was writing the book, I mean, part of what I wanted to do was to create a coherent narrative that made sense, that went all the way from Babylon right up to the present. So as a time span of 4,000 years. So I wanted to tell a story that was coherent, but I also wanted to tell a story that was interesting. And so sometimes I chose to include things because I just thought they were particularly fascinating stories. But I also tried to pick ones that would illuminate the argument that I was making and provide a good illustration of the general themes that I was trying to outline.
One more question from the participants. In the past, scientific progress seemed to happen with big breakthroughs by famous individuals, but now it feels slower, more continuous, and less connected to scientific people. We don't see many star scientists anymore. What do you think about this?
So let me make sure I've got the question right. So science in the past was dependent on individual people and seemed to happen much more quickly, whereas now science isn't attached to particular people and happens to go more slowly. Was that the question? And continuously.
Yes, yes.
I think is that the question? I just wanted to make sure I understood it. Yes. So part of it is that science now has got enormous equipment, and so everything is done by teamwork. There's no longer any room for the individual discoverer. I think that's one of the most sort of regrettable things in the way that science has changed, is that you, in a sense, in order to get funding, you have to predict in advance what your results are going to be. It's almost as though you know what you're going to show. If you think back even till the middle of the last century, people like Francis Crick and James Watson, who were two named individuals, were able to embark on a research project to discover the structure of DNA without that being their main project. It was not what they were employed to do. They were studying something else and just decided that they were going to do that research as a sideline. And I think that's one of the great drawbacks of modern science, is that sort of deviation from an original plan is no longer possible. And while I mentioned DNA, I would like to sidetrack myself, and I want to talk a bit about Rosalind Franklin. So you asked me earlier about what the great myths of science. And one of the myths of science I particularly regret is the way that women are represented in the history of science. So I think the most famous woman in the history of science is Marie Curie. And Marie Curie is always presented as a martyr to science, as a victim. She's always shown as looking very harassed, that there's always the emphasis on how incredibly hard she worked, how she didn't have any money, how she had to spend years and years sieving through tons of pitch blende in order to extract a tiny portion of radioactive radium. So she's presented as a martyr and unfortunate victim. And that's very much a stereotype of how women are presented. And the same thing has happened to Rosalind Franklin. She's not remembered or celebrated as a successful scientist in her own right. She's always presented as someone who was the victim of the deviousness of two men, in particular of James Watson, when he wrote the book, The Double Helix, several years after she'd already died. I think it's far more important to remember her and to celebrate her as a great scientist, particularly in the light of COVID. She was the founder of virology. She was the first person to decipher using X-ray diffraction techniques. She was the first person to decipher the molecular structure of a virus. It was a tobacco mosaic virus. She went on to discover the structures of several more viruses, and when she died very young. She was only 39. She died of cancer. But before she died, she had already started work on polio virus, and her researcher assistant, Aaron Klug, went on to isolate the polio virus and win the Nobel Prize for that. So I think instead of being stereotyped as a female victim, the victim of Crick and Watson. She should be celebrated as the person who founded the new science of virology, which in the current era is of incredible importance. So that's, I mean, that way in which women are represented in science, I think, desperately needs to be overturned. So we should be celebrating Rosalind Franklin for her own achievements. We should be celebrating someone like Dorothy Hodgkin, who is the only British woman who's won a Nobel Prize for science. And very few people, even in this country, have even heard of her, because she was a nice, very, very nice woman. She was married with 4 children, and she did her work extremely successfully and was a very, very high achiever. But she doesn't have a stereotypical female story of victimhood to go with her and to grab attention.
How should we teach science history? Maybe
How should we teach science history? I think it's very difficult, because I think you have to, I mean, if you're educating children, you need to teach them about the big names in the history of science, like, I know, Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin and people like that. Otherwise, you're not really educating them properly. But I think you also have to make the history of science seem relevant to them. And I think one way of doing that, which is very attractive to children, is to focus on their immediate locality and find people who were famous, or not necessarily hugely famous in scientists, but scientists who were attached to their local area, and encouraged school children to carry out research into them, because then it gives them some sort of relevance, some significance, some feeling that they too grow up to be scientists. Whereas if you just present the great names, they seem too abstract, they seem too elevated, they seem unrealistic as role models for the children to attain to.
For the last question, we have a lot of like young researchers in our groups. So what would you like suggest to them, like keeping their motivation up? And because like they when we're reading the books like yours, like we were like big scientists, but probably if we were to leave that era, we would be in the the peasants or something else, I think. So what would you suggest for the the modern researchers, like how should take their work, and how to keep their motivation up?
How should young researchers keep their motivation up? I think it would be easier if they were paid more. That's sort of rather beyond my control. I think when you're, I know from talking to people in Cambridge that a lot of scientists are just absorbed in the idea of finding out new information, even if it's a new. It's the same when you're doing historical research as it is with science. If you become interested in a subject, even if it's very arcane, esoteric, nobody else is interested in it, even if it's a sort of seems like a very small corner of science, the thrill of finding out something new is quite extraordinary. I mean, it's rather like Sherlock Holmes or a famous detective sort of unearthing a clue and managing to find an answer. I mean, it just gives you a huge buzz and an excitement. And of course, there's a lot of tedium associated with that. You've got to write up your report. You probably got to spend months and months and months and months in order just to accumulate one tiny result. But when you do get that result, it's such a buzz of satisfaction to know it's something that you've achieved yourself. So I think being a scientific researcher is perhaps one of the most rewarding careers that you can have. I think if you're going to stay in pure science, you have to forget the idea that you're going to earn a large salary. But on the other hand, you can have the sort of the moral satisfaction of knowing that you haven't sold yourself to a large company, and that you're not going to be exploiting other people, and you're going to contribute to improvement in the world rather than to deterioration. So I think that sort of moral guidance can provide a great boost to your motivation.
Thank you. This has been an extraordinary evening for the Halka Book Club. Dr. Fara, your book has sparked so many discussions in our meetings, and having you here to answer our questions directly has been invaluable. Dr. Fara, on behalf of all Halka members, both here tonight and those who will watch the recording, thank you for taking time to join our book club from Cambridge. Your book has truly expanded our understanding of science as a human endeavor that belongs to all cultures. What would you like to share? Any final thoughts with Halka Book Club?
What was, sorry, I was reading that comment down there. So what was your final question? Say it again.
What would you like to share? Any final thoughts?
What would I like to say? I'd like to say thank you. And I am enormously flattered that you invited me to speak and that so many of you are interested in my book. It's just absolutely wonderful. And perhaps it's a bit like the answer to the previous question. I mean, I wrote that book 20 years ago. I had absolutely no idea that 20 years after that, so many people in Turkey would be interested in what I'd said. But that's the sort of perk, the sort of prize, the reward that gives you the motivation to go on writing and researching and thinking, because it's just wonderful to be able to reach so many people. And I'm very grateful to you, and I feel extremely honored and flattered. So I think the thanks should be from me to you rather than from you to me.
Honor belongs to us. Thank you again, Dr. Fara, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Have a good evening, and we hope you face-to-face, Dr. Fara, one day, either or in Turkey. Thank you.
I would
Have
love
a
to
good
do
night.
that. Good night, and thank you to everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.